COVID-19 continues to disrupt life as we know it. The country's governing party will testify to this when it celebrates one of its biggest occasions virtually without a mass rally. Today, the ANC marks 109 years of existence, but it will be a low-key event with the party's January 8th statement being delivered virtually by party president Cyril Ramaphosa.
Engaging with community members on a door-to-door campaign. Among them, a family in Colville, 42 adults and children crammed into a small house in a state of disrepair. The family says they felt honored last year when the president paid them a visit. They say they knew at that moment that their lives might change for better. The family says few days later, 2 businessmen arrived at their house offering to build 6 houses for them. The project is said to be spearheaded by the Office of the Executive Mayor of the Solblaki municipality. The family says they were told to vacate their house to allow for renovations. This heap of sand here, the only renovation material ever delivered. Exactly a year later, family members remain separated.
My heart is very sore. Just because we as family is broken, because we must move out of the house, just because
All right, well, for more on the January 8th statement, we're joined by political analyst and senior research associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue, Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, always a pleasure to see you. Thank you very much for giving us your time on SABC News this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Flo, and all the best to you and the viewers and the SABC staff.
You know, it will be very different this year for the ANC. We're expecting the president, of course, to deliver the January 8th statement. Usually, you know, it's a time, especially in the election year, for the party to kind of show its might, to fill up a stadium. This is going to be different this time around. What do you think the focus will really be on? Because, you know, this time around, the content of what is said is quite important, as opposed to us focusing maybe on the crowds that would have been there. This time around, we're listening to what exactly is being said by the president. So the content is quite key. Bearing all that in mind, what do you think that the president is supposed to or should be focusing on?
I think, firstly, to take your first point about what this means with regard to the optics. More importantly, I think what is interesting for us, or for me, would be the lack of distraction in the room. So to understand that what's going on in terms of the statement that's being delivered, or the actual speech that's being delivered, how the content actually talks to the current body politic of the state, but also the current kind of body the organizational political landscape and the overall landscape of the party itself. And those two cannot be emphasized more, because, you know, the one leads into the other and vice versa, because they both kind of intertwined. And I think in that way, the focus of the content and the themes and the kind of issues that will be discussed or referenced in the speech this evening will have to be about, I think we've got a bit of a preview of that with what Ms. Mokonyane had said yesterday about COVID-19, the emergency of COVID-19, the impact that this would have. I think also trying to allay fears that the party has some kind of vision around this. But again, you know, that's something that we'll have to see what comes out in terms of the difference between what he said and what is a rhetoric and what is a narrative based on what implementation takes place. And then, of course, the question around ensuring that, you know, the challenge around corruption is not just about focusing on state corruption, but the fact of the matter is there is corruption that's all around us. And in the context of COVID-19, we saw how that corruption became unconscionable with regard to PPE tenders. So obviously, with the rollout and the rollout of the vaccination and that stuff, we'd have to see how the process is managed, how the implementation is carried out, and ensuring that we don't end up in a situation where maybe there's no middlemen at the moment who may step into the fold and trying to act as facilitators of this rollout of the vaccine and implementation of the vaccination. But at the same time, we've got to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where it's another type or another kind of construct of corruption that underpins this rollout. So we've got to be very vigilant about that. And then finally, I think we can't ignore that it's an election year. There's no optics right now that's going to distract us from the speech. And you rightly said, Flo, it's going to be about focusing on the content and actually unpacking what the president says later this evening. But it's also about the fact that people, the elective conferences have to, the question would be, what would be the status of the elective conferences at the provincial level? Because that will have a key impact or a key factor in driving the idea of the candidate list that will be drawn up for the 9 provinces to contest the local government election. And also bearing in mind, there's no walkabout here. There's no kind of build-up to this January 8th statement with what we saw in your insert. But this is going to be important in terms of how the election lobby or the election campaign and the rollout takes place with regard to the unfolding of the election manifesto, the kind of election lobbying that takes place in the run-up to the election, and bearing in mind that we also have an NGC in May.
Yeah. I'd like to touch on a number of the issues that you've spoken about, but just before I touch on the issue of COVID-19 and corruption, you just said something quite interesting, and in terms of the party and the content, what's essential, what has to be said by the president. Over the years, I've noticed, and I'm sure the public has noticed, that the ANC has leaned very heavily on the fact that there are this liberation movement, and so people have obviously voted for them based on that history of perhaps my mother voted for the ANC, my father voted for the ANC, but things are a little bit different now. They cannot really rely very much on the issue of them being a liberation movement. What else can they latch on, apart from being this liberation movement, from being the first democratically elected government? What party, what more can they say at this point that will draw, I suppose, younger voters to them?
Flo, the point about the party itself, we know that it's been in decline for a number of years. We see that it's in a state of complete disarray when it comes to the internal governance structure, the factionalism, the fragmentation. The fact of the matter is, I don't think that Luthuli House is in a state of central authority. This has been said a number of times in the media. It's been written by opinion makers, commentators, and other analysts, and including the media itself. So I think the point here is that what this party needs to do is get around all these fluffy ideas of being an old liberation movement. Move away from this kind of hanging on to a past that somehow is moving further away from what your real identity should be. You should actually start thinking about becoming much more about what it is here and now that people want. I myself, just looking around friends, family, and other colleagues, when you talk to younger people, there's no capturing of the imagination by the party. I think the challenge for this party is trying to get rid of all of the excesses that are hanging on to this party that doesn't really make any sense, relevance in the current context of what a political organization should be. I think we are seeing this in the context of how selfishness has become an overriding sense of what this party is becoming, and the ego is becoming completely out of bounds with regard to how people are hanging on to power. If we take anything from the lesson that we saw on Wednesday in the capital of Washington and the storming of the legislature in Washington, is that there is a disconnect. And you can't continue to live in an ivory tower. And I think this is where the ivory tower politics needs to start being dismantled by not just the ANC, but all political parties who don't really see themselves moving in the direction they should. We should never even think about that kind of scene that played out in Washington to ever happen in South Africa. And this is a lesson for the ANC to learn.
Yeah. Maybe I read too much into what Nomvula Mokonyane was saying yesterday, but it did seem that there was no interest in touching on issues of corruption, because of course when you touch on the issues of corruption, you're starting to show that perhaps the party isn't as united as they'd like to show, and especially on January 8th, on the birthday of the movement, they would want to show this united front. It does seem that there's no plan really to respond to the issues of corruption, and corruption being a pressing issue. Nomvula Mokonyane said that they'll be talking about the pressing issues issues that are facing the country, and I would think that corruption is one of those pressing issues. Would it be a huge mistake for them not to address the issues of corruption?
I do think that you can't ignore it. It remains the biggest scourge on our society today, not just in South Africa, I think the world over, where corruption, greed, just complete selfishness around material wealth, gains, etc., has become a selfish interest for capturing power at the center, or becoming a powerful institution that remains in power. And I think you can't ignore this, because it's at the heart of the critical dimensions and analysis of where the unbundling, unhinging of this party rests on. And if you ignore it, you're ignoring it at your own peril, because you're doing so and you're saying, we can't talk about corruption because, corruption, we want to present a united front. Let's be honest. Let's have an honest appraisal of the party. It's not a united front. It's no longer based on any lines of unity in the party. This idea of talking about unity and calling for unity, we know it doesn't exist. We know that in the party, there's so many fragmentation. There's so many different factions. There's so many different levels of disunity in the party that you can't keep trying to show a united front when we know it's not there. And I think that's what I was referring to in my previous comment when I said you need to be honest about who you are, what you are, and why you want to actually be ruling party and continue. Because I think if you're genuinely honest about the fact that this party is going through an existential crisis, and it needs to be reviewed and renewed in a way where it doesn't fall back on its own sword each time that we have to talk about corruption or we talk about the individuals that are implicated in corruption. It falls on its own sword. It actually doesn't implement its own resolution. So I think at this point in time, try not to become, present a facade to the society, because in a way you're not doing yourself a service. You're actually just reinforcing the distrust that maybe the overall majority of South Africans or sections of the South African public have in terms of saying, well, you're not being truthful to us. Yeah. Be honest about what it is that you are doing, and I think that will go a long way.
Certainly today will really be anticipating the elections and of course trying to paint the party in a good light. And I mean, you and I can discuss all the issues within the ANC. You can talk about the crisis, but then when those numbers start to trickle in, we always see it. The ANC is still leading. And when you look at this year where there's what I'm seeing as a weaker DA this time around, I wonder what you kind of foresee, and maybe I'm being unfair to you, but what do you see, going forward, during the elections, after the elections? I mean, will all of these issues really have an impact on the party, whether it is the issue of COVID-19 corruption, whether it is the lack of unity in the party? I mean, will these issues ultimately make an impact on that person and what party they choose to put that X next to?
I think, firstly, the level of apathy where people just don't know who to vote for anymore. They're not sure about the ANC. They're not sure about the opposition parties. They don't have any sense of confidence in the governance of the running of this country, whether in terms of the legislature or whether in terms of the executive. They're just in a complete state of lack of any kind of confidence or trust in the system. Will stay away from the polls. So that's the danger we have in this election. That at the local government level, which this local government election is the most important one, because it is about the participatory democracy, about voting for your mayors, voting for your local ward councillors and so forth. I think people will just become despondent and stay away. That is a danger for me, because the way our electoral system is built, it actually enables for the ANC or any other individual or a political party to come in, because they're not necessarily coming on the basis of what the issues are, if indeed they are genuinely committed to them. But they may be coming into power because there's a greater proportion of the electorate that stayed away and didn't want to go out to vote. And I think that in itself becomes the Achilles heel. It becomes the actual contradiction and the paradox of our democracy, because we talk about democracy that is participatory, but then the election may become the key driver in how people go out to vote. The other problem we have in this country is that the electoral system needs to be revisited. Because if we don't revisit the PR system, we're going to end up with the same people, or we're going to have a revolving door where we're going to keep complaining about who's in power and who's governing, but we can't really get them out, because the system in itself is inherently predicated on keeping these individuals in place. So obviously we're dealing with a lot of issues here. And it will be interesting to see what Parliament does with the recommendations that came from the Constitutional Court about bringing in or revising the electoral model in terms of allowing independent candidates to stand and contest elections, but not for 2021 local government elections, but for 2024.
All right. Sanusha, it's always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so very much for your in-depth input on the show. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
All right, that's Sanusha Naidu there speaking to us. She is a political analyst and, of course, as well, the senior research associate at the Institute of Global Dialogue. All right, well, COVID-19 continues to disrupt life as we know it. The country's governing party will testify to this when it celebrates one of its biggest occasions virtually without a mass rally, as we spoke about. Well, today the ANC marks 109 years of existence, but it will be a low-key event with the party's January 8th statement being delivered virtually by the party president, Cyril Ramaphosa.
Good evening, comrades and fellow compatriots. You are now tuned to Radio Freedom, the voice of the African National Congress.
It was under tough apartheid years in 1972 when the ANC marked the birth of its party with a statement outlining its program for the year. The ANC has kept the tradition to remember the 1912 establishment of what would become a liberation to emancipate black people. The voice of the exiled party president O.R. Tambo became familiar to those who managed to get his message at the height of the apartheid rule. The party has gone through many phases since its establishment in 1912. Initially formed as the South African Native National Congress in Bloemfontein, the organization changed its name to the African National Congress a decade later. From inception, the organization represented traditional and modern elements from church, communities, and educated black professionals. While women were admitted as affiliate members, they later became full members in 1943. Rich in history, the party has ensured that it documents its journey in the history books. Amongst the norm is commemorating its birth 8 January 1912 through celebratory activities. In 1972, while banned, the oldest liberation movement on the African continent coordinated its commemoration from foreign soil in Lusaka, Zambia. The ANC President Oliver Tambo penned the first January 8 statement when the party marked 60 years of existence.
You see, what conclusions can you draw from the fact that a South African young man goes to the Soviet Union, learns how to handle weapons, comes back, uses those weapons to gain his freedom?
The party's tune slightly changed under former President Nelson Mandela, as his statement was more on nation building with a quest for social cohesion. However, this brought a rise of a new enemy, inequality, a beast that up to this day the ANC fails to defeat.
We observe the 79th anniversary of the foundation of the ANC. On this historic occasion, I greet you all on behalf of our President, Comrade Oliver Tambo, the National Executive Committee of the ANC, and the rest of our membership.
The party also had to evolve from being a liberation movement to a political party that can contest elections. This was evident in former President Thabo Mbeki's 2007 January 8 statement. That's when he took a fight to the global stage, eyeing for global participation of South Africa.
This year, 2007, we enter into the last 5 years at whose conclusion we will celebrate the centenary of the birth of the African National Congress, an occasion whose significance will surely resonate across our land.
Now in charge, the ANC faces its own challenges, still haunted by the dream of its former President Nelson Mandela of an equal society. Almost 3 decades into democracy, This still remains a dream. President Jacob Zuma's January 8 statement coincided with the 60th anniversary of the Freedom Charter and 21 years since the first democratic pulse. But looking at what was achieved, questions were starting to be posed if indeed it was tough for a liberation movement to govern after attaining power. In his speech, Zuma said South Africa's challenges remain the triple challenges of unemployment, poverty and inequality. This would show the ANC, in its second phase of the democratic transition, still had a long way to go in reaching its goals and emancipating blacks who were still ravaged by poverty.
As we move into the future, the ANC will renew its internal systems and processes in order to prepare and produce new generations of leadership for our country whose integrity and passion to serve our country is unquestionable.
In the year 2020, the road went to the Northern Cape. Hundreds attended to hear the marching orders from the party's president. A different tune, the governing party had been facing internal rifts. The speech highlighted the task the party needed to focus on, and amongst them, to end factionalism within its ranks.
The 108 years of the existence of the ANC have been marked by advances and setbacks, progress and detours, mistakes and corrections.
And now, the ANC government will in future have to deliver a statement that tells how it fared in the battle against the coronavirus pandemic. With corruption allegations and a weak health system in some provinces, it will be interesting to see how the party records its performance. Mtlanhla Khatlani, SABC News, Johannesburg.